The following video is part of the Northern California Training Academy and Casey Family Program's Crisis Communication and Preparation video series. This series is designed to walk child welfare leaders through steps to take in order to be prepared before an incident occurs, including the development of a crisis communication plan, working within a political environment, and creating a narrative that promotes successful solutions that will improve the safety and well-being of children and families in care.
We're going to touch over the next 20 to 30 minutes or so on a question we get all the time, and which Casey asked us to address, which is the use of what I'll call traditional media or old media, and versus the idea of using new media. We are often asked, should I do it this way or that way? We tend to believe that that's not the right question, that the question is how do we use them in a complementary way? In crises, the best way to handle a crisis is to have a really effective communications operation ongoing. How to use this in the best way, both new media and traditional media in an ongoing way. So I'm going to let Randy start with the new, and I'll end with the old.
Thank you, Steve. So, needless to say, the world of media and communications and technology is changing incredibly rapidly all the time. And in the old world, certainly it used to be that if you wanted to get your message out to a whole lot of people, we were really dependent on old media gatekeepers. And these were the stodgy newspaper editors and the TV news directors and folks at the radio stations, et cetera, who could help determine what was news and what they put out. And that's changing quite rapidly now as a result of tools that a lot of people in this room will be familiar with. As far as social media in a crisis, social media allows agencies to bypass the news media filter. So it really lets you all put out information in your own way, on your own terms, to do that instantly, to potentially reach a lot of people doing this. Certainly if there is a lot of interest, social media allows messages to be amplified quite a bit. So even if, let's say you have a Twitter account, and even if you don't have that many specific people following your Twitter account, if it's of enough interest, it can be what they call retweeted and passed around again and again and again. So you can reach a considerable audience by using social media. It provides the opportunity to correct misinformation, or at least address misinformation if necessary, and it lets you bring in other authoritative and credible information to the conversation, whether that's linking to a local law enforcement agency, another agency, et cetera. However, it's something of a double-edged sword, as these things tend to be, in that depending on your social media tool, other people can use social media as well to spread information that may not be accurate and could be much worse than inaccurate. It could actually be, defamatory or whatever else. And it's also a communications tool that you can't control, or at least what other folks have to say is something that you can't control. So it is the proverbial mixed bag, but there are ways to harness it effectively. We wanted to touch on some do's and don'ts in the event of a crisis. You may find that lots of people are commenting, or at least there's a lot of buzz about a particular event. It's important to respond very quickly on social media and to update your social media channels frequently. As I mentioned, you can use this as a way to disseminate authoritative and correct information, either yourself or linking it to where it can be found elsewhere online. Consistency is a message we've heard a lot today, and that's certainly true online as well. You've got your faction, you're going to stick with them. And it's important to deliver your one or your two, your small number of absolute core messages, and in the event of a crisis, it may very well be one single message. And then finally, to always remain courteous and calm if you're manning a Twitter account or a Facebook account. And that means not getting defensive or argumentative. Another don't is to go silent in the event of a crisis. It's very important to keep them updated and to not just vanish. And if you're spreading information, it's important that all your information, you to be completely factual, to follow the same guidelines that we talked about when you're talking to a reporter, that it's difficult to unsay something to a reporter, and it's difficult to unsay something online. Now, on Facebook, it's very easy for people to leave messages on your account that are not kind, that are negative, that are critical. They could very well be completely false. Our recommendation, if you're maintaining a Facebook account in particular, is to briefly correct misinformation with another comment online, and then again to direct users to the website or to whether it's your own website or a law enforcement website or somewhere else that has accurate information. Or if there's a news story that's been put out that has accurate information and you want to highlight that, feel free to link to that as well. And then again, transparency to the degree that it's possible. If you can, illustrate what your agency is doing, and again, link to correct, accurate information. Those are good things. In the don't column on this, don't delete negative comments if other folks are saying things that are negative. What's on social media, people see often right away, and if you pick things off and delete them, it often can give the impression of trying to, whether it's hide something or sweep something away. It's best to confront them directly. Again, being defensive and argumentative is a no-no, and being pulled into a back and forth. This idea of if people are leaving negative comments, it's not something you want to get into an argument about. You want to address things and then move on. It's important to determine ahead of time what social media channels your agency is going to use, who's responsible for monitoring social media in general, and then updating those specific social media channels, and then critically, what authority is required to post information. And I think as part of that is, what information are we willing to or allowed to post? Obviously, that's going to change depending on the situation, but if you have, as a previous speaker mentioned, a clear list of what's fair game to share with the public and what's not, and if that list is shared and well known, that should clear up any miscommunication or misinformation about what can actually go online. Here is a brief case study taken from just this past Friday. There's a shooting at LAX, and LAX officials used their Twitter account to spread correct information. So here we have a tweet letting people know about the incident at LAX and that law enforcement is at the scene. And the LAX officials also used Twitter as a medium to let people know what to expect. So in this case, there was a press conference coming up. And the advantages here were that this was an authoritative source that went directly to the public and to news media, and they didn't need to rely on anyone else to get their message out. And in fact, the LAX website crashed during this incident because of all the sudden interest in the airport and in people trying to catch flights or pick up loved ones, but Twitter continued. Similarly, as Steve mentioned, the Boston Marathon bombing, Twitter was used very effectively by authorities in Boston as well. And that also goes for Boston media. What the police department was able to do was reassure the public that they were on it, that they were to spread information so that people who were in harm's path or might be in harm's path understood that, and then people who were safe understood that. And also, as Steve said, if there was nothing to report right away, but there would be a new report coming out in the future, they let you know that. So you never were wondering sort of who's minding the store. There was always a clear sense of command in that instance. So we've mentioned Facebook and Twitter. Facebook, you're primarily communicating to a defined audience. So while anyone can visit a Facebook account for an open agency, it will only enter your personal Facebook feed if you have actively decided that you like an organization or that you're going to follow an organization. Facebook is a very media-rich environment, so there's often opportunity to post photos, videos, games, polls. There's all kinds of different things that you can do on Facebook. And it's really geared toward two-way dialogue and discussion. That process makes for deeper engagement, although at the same time that potentially requires more time and effort to maintain. Twitter, on the other hand, tends to be more of a broadcast medium, where while you can certainly reply to a tweet, those don't get disseminated the same way that the original tweet itself does. So it lets you speak to a broad audience, and tweets can be, as I mentioned, retweeted very easily. They can also be searched. You might find that if there's a big crisis, like as with in the Boston Marathon, a hashtag will develop, which, as you probably know, is the £sign and then a phrase. And all the tweets and all the information that are related to that event will tend to have that hashtag, which makes it clear what you're talking about and also makes your social media posts searchable. So it's very easy to aggregate everything that has to do with that particular topic. So if in the event that there is a major incident or tragedy that might deserve its own hashtag, that's something that will let your information be very easy to find. For the most part, there's text, just doing text on Twitter is perfectly acceptable, more so than Facebook. As a result, there is not as much of a time commitment for the most part to maintain Twitter. As I mentioned, it's better suited to broadcasting information, and as a result, in our view, in a crisis situation, it's a more valuable tool. I think no matter what you're using, it's important to not let social media channels go stale. So if you're going to open a Facebook page or have a Twitter account, it's important to keep it updated on a regular basis, because otherwise it can really convey an impression of no one being home, and it's kind of a sad impact when you actually go onto a Facebook page and no one's touched it in quite a while. And obviously there's a lot we could say about using these media beyond the narrow crisis scenario. As well. But in a crisis scenario, these are some important things to keep in mind. So, a couple questions and answers that we often receive. We recommend at a bare minimum updating your Twitter account several times a week. We recommend building a following by not only talking about your own agency, but also linking to information that might be of interest to your community in general, whether it's something another agency is doing or something else going on in your community. Invest in what other people are doing on social media. So follow other Twitter profiles, see what else is being talked about. And there are some useful tools to do that. And then as far as if you don't have an account and you're interested in setting one up, it's very easy to do. And you can really go to the homepage and they can help from there. That's our quick take on social media in a crisis. And then Steve's going to go old school.
Before I do that, I want to mention something about this language he was just talking about for the last 10 minutes. Because I have a sense for some of you sort of picked up on some of what he was saying, and you might not have picked up on too much of what he was saying, and which is okay, because I find myself thinking that way every day at the office. We had a case with a client 2 years ago where our client was, let's call him an old school guy, ran a very public business that we all know about and we all read about. And the chairman and CEO of that company was making significant news on a local and national basis. And the company and the communications people and the public affairs people and the chairman and the CEO were watching that good old LA Times every day, every hour, to see what was being posted and so forth by this one publication online. And so we would provide this information to the client, and then we started evaluating how often this client was being discussed on Twitter. And that client was being discussed on Twitter on the order of, and I don't have the exact numbers, 10 times every second in America. There was a national conversation about our client, and all he was waiting was to see if the LA Times was updating a story about him. So so we changed our game plan a little bit, and we decided to become part of the conversation. But the point is that, well, Randy's discussing this. I think the important takeaway is that whether you like it or not, and we've been talking about this a lot today, if you don't respond, there's still a conversation about you or the case. And with Twitter in particular, there is a significant amount of conversation in 140 characters or less going on about various topics all day long. news media, reporters themselves are using Twitter to promote the stories they're writing about you. There's this private school in Los Angeles called Harvard Westlake, and there was a big story about them last week in the LA Times. And the reporter, Jim Rainey, who's a old-timer, I would consider, reporter, a very good reporter who wrote the story, was tweeting about his upcoming story in the Los Angeles Times, and then was tweeting to get people to respond to his story, and then was tweeting about the most interesting responses. So he took his one-day story and on Twitter turned it into a week-long story. So as you investigate what options exist for you on Twitter or Facebook or some of these other medium, go take a look at the conversation that's taking place. It's a really important first step to take. Like, you know, Randy was actually the one who would come in and say, there's this whole conversation going on about this client of ours. And because I don't follow Twitter, I wasn't following Twitter myself on this. And it was amazing how important people, news media, and others that we care deeply about were having this discussion independent of our good Los Angeles Times. So it's a very important communications environment that's not going anywhere but growing, and it's critically important, I think, to all of us, and especially to agencies like yourselves who are part of the public discussion. So that's my 2 cents on that. And I'll be curious as you go back, if you haven't monitored what you're learning. I think Casey would love to know, and we would love to know. So all right, now go back to the kinds of traditional media I think we tend to talk a fair amount about. First of all, when you look at the full menu of options for traditional media, and these options are, do we do a press conference? Do we do a one-on-one interview? Do we issue a statement, and so forth? Understand those media who are most likely to be interested in what you're having to say, because that will help guide you into what choices you make. So for broadcast, I think we all understand that they need visuals. For print, not as much, but they want in-depth content. Radio tends to have very minimal needs. They'll take a 1-minute phone conversation and be able to use that and put it on the air. And then online, I think, certainly is a hybrid of needs. So when you consider your options, these are the questions that you should be asking yourself, and this will help guide you to making some decisions on what traditional venues you might want to use. What's the nature of the crisis? Is it one of these crises that's so critical that you're going to have to do a press conference to address, in real time what's going on? What's the nature of the crisis? What information can we share? Certainly, if you don't have a lot of information that you can share, you're probably not going to want to call a press conference, and then have to take all these questions that you can't answer. What information do we want to share? Who else would support us publicly? If you have information to share and you have others who are willing to support you publicly, we tend to like a press conference as a venue because it demonstrates, the visual in and of itself is sending a message. What other players may be going public, you always have to understand, I played a lot of sports growing up. What's the other side going to do? What's the other team going to do? What's in their playbook? And you should anticipate that, monitor for that. That can help inform what kind of vehicle you use. What's the arc of the story? And what we mean is this a one-time story that goes away tomorrow, or is this something that we're going to be living with for the next week, for the next month, for the next year? And depending, if there's more longevity to it, you're probably going to go more in depth to set your foundation as you move forward. And then also, what's the appetite? Sometimes we all sit in a room and we think this is the biggest story and everyone cares about it, and that's actually not the case. And so understanding what the appetite is really important to determining what kind of vehicle you're going to use. If that appetite might be a couple of television stations, then set up separate meetings with those television stations, do the interviews, and call it a day. So it's something important to look at. So here are some options, and on the case study we were discussing this morning, these were actually the very options we spent with this client talking about in great detail. The press conference, this is why you would do a press conference. Understanding that doing so, this is probably the highest risk environment you're in, because you could have, when Randy was in the media, I'm sure he was different and nicer, but there's a mentality of a pack mentality, and so one aggressive reporter starts asking tough questions, then you feel sort of insignificant, so you got to step up and ask a better question and harder question, and it builds on itself, and so you have to be careful of that. The one-on-one interviews, we tend to like a great deal in our business. You have a lot of control, and the opposite is true with the media there. They tend, and I can't say broad brush, but tend to be more courteous and a bit more polite when they're by themselves. They're also not as well informed as the pack tends to be, so you can manage that sometimes a little bit better. Releasing a statement is an often used vehicle to put out when you're busy, but you want to be responsive, but you don't want to have your director on the phone with 8 different media or your spokesperson. And it tends to just get the job done. It's imperfect in many ways because it's not showing the kinds of transparency we've been hearing about this morning. It's sort of transparent, but not really, because you don't have a real person saying those words directly and being willing to take questions from the press. The idea of saying no comment, you might as well just stamp guilty on your forehead. So figure out more artful ways of saying it that way. We've given you one here. We'd hope to be able to provide you information soon, but we just can't do it right now. And just other ways out than no comment. And Randy and I do a fair amount of media training with clients, and we put them through the toughest question, and I can't tell you, it's like, a genetic thing where they just start saying no comment because it's just what they go to because they've seen it so many times in their lives. But again, when we ask them politely, what do you think, and we show them on video, and we ask them, what do you think you're conveying there? They confirm that they're conveying that they're hiding something or that they're confirming the negative question that's being asked by saying no comment. So PR people really hate these 2 words together that way. And so we suggest more artful ways of not being able to provide information at this point. Again, I think I set this brief session up as a discussion of communications channels, communications vehicles. Let's not forget the message is really the most important thing for you to focus on. How you get those messages out vary on every case. I did mention this before, and I believe it to my soul, that it's how you're seen managing the crisis. The words count, but your actions count tremendously, and that's where providing a comment, providing access tends to buy a lot of credibility with news media and other stakeholder audiences. You are public agencies, you're not a private business, and so there's an expectation that you are, part of the public conversation, and that you owe us something. And oftentimes it'll work to your benefit to provide that information publicly. We've talked about stakeholders. They're likely to engage in this whether you do or not, and they won't always say the kindest things about you. So, the best way you can control a conversation is to participate in that conversation. And, always consider what you're trying, what are we trying to accomplish today or this week on this topic? And that will help drive you to what choices you make in choosing the vehicles that are at your fingertips, from Twitter to calling a big old press conference and inviting everyone to come and hear what you have to say and be willing to answer their questions. That's it from us on old versus new, which is really old and new, I think, is our suggested takeaway. It's not one or the other.